Hello everyone, and welcome to SOB, where we talk to pioneers of knowledge, art and culture, to those whose hard work has been focused on creating a better environment for humanity. In today's program, I talk to someone who's dedicated more than 5 decades of his life to bold anti-war actions and political activism that benefit people from both his own community and internationally. This is SOB, and I'm your host, Hassan Tabakoli. Ajamu Baraka was born in October 1953. He's an American political activist and serves as the national organizer and spokesperson for the Black Alliance for Peace. Baraka has served on the boards of several human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Africa Action. As the Southern Regional Director of Amnesty International USA, Baraka was instrumental in developing the organization's 1998 campaign to expose human rights violations in the United States. Ajamu Baraka, welcome to the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to start about asking about your childhood. How was it like growing in your own neighborhood?
I had a very interesting childhood, I guess. Everybody says that. But I grew up on the south side of Chicago, one of the major cities in the U.S., and grew up in a situation where it was comfortable for a while, but I didn't really understand the precariousness of the life that we were living. We were quite poor, but as a child, all you were looking for is food to eat and a place to play. And that's how it was for my first 10 years. After the age of 10, when my parents separated, I like to say, or I say that that was really the beginning of my real life, because things became even more difficult. We ended up in some quite difficult circumstances in terms of how we lived, sharing a house with 2 other families, sharing a bathroom, and having to work myself with my father for 5 years as a janitor, which is basically a maintenance person.
And how old were you then?
I started working at 10. Yeah. And so every morning for 5 years, I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go to work with my father before I went to school. But it was a very good experience. That's when I began to understand that there were class differences. I understood the unfairness of people who were born into poverty and how difficult it was to get out of poverty. I began to receive a elementary understanding of how the system was being organized and the impact it had on people like myself. And I think that laid the foundation for my political work that I began to engage in a very serious way by the time I was 18 and ended up facing a draft in the United States military. Ended up in the military. This is during the Vietnam period, and that's when I really became a political activist in the military.
And how did you manage with school during these years?
Well, school was a very difficult situation. I was very good at school, but I had issues with adhering to discipline coming from people, and I was attracted somewhat to the streets for a while. I ended up dropping out of high school, but because I was committed to education, because that was such an important value in our family, even though I dropped out of high school and ended up in the military, I started the process of educating myself, and so I went back to school. I got a high school diploma. I started taking college classes, and once I finished my military service, I went straight into the university.
And so 7 decades on, what do you do nowadays? What's your main field of work?
Well, as I said, the beginning was a process of developing a political consciousness and then becoming an activist. Eventually, I became an educator. But what grounded all of that work was my commitment to activism, to organizing, building social movement, embracing and understanding the human rights framework, the liberal framework at that time, but understanding that there were elements of that framework that allowed us to raise critical questions about how society was organized, not only in the U.S., but globally. So today, that work continues. I've been involved in activism for something like 53 years. And today I am the chair of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, a formation that we started developing in 2017, right after I ran on the ticket with Jill Stein with the Green Party as vice president. Once that campaign was concluded, beginning in January 2017, I began to build this new formation, the Black Alliance for Peace, that we officially launched on April the 4th, 2017. April the 4th is the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And we use that as the launching point for this organization that's committed toward peace, committed to people-centered human rights, and anti-imperialism. And I've been developing that formation ever since. I'm on the leadership body of a number of pro-peace and anti-imperialist organizations, the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the U.S. Peace Council. So my work in human rights, my work against imperialism and for peace continues.
And you're watching SOB. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this short break.
What we are fighting against today actually really started with the invasion of 1492. Those historical events put into place tragic consequences that impacted both your people and my people. And that's why it's important for us to talk about why it is so fundamentally required for us to find a way to struggle together.
You spoke about an experience with the Vietnam War. How did that shape your worldview and have an effect on your future political activism?
Well, what it helped me to conclude was that I was living in a society that was part or the leadership of an empire, and that this empire was the leader of a coalition of states whose very existence was as a consequence of their ability to impose their will on the majority of humankind. That it was a parasitic relationship that resulted in the development of what we refer to today as the West, and the underdevelopment of the rest of us. I say us, even though we lived in the U.S., people need to understand that the majority of the black population in the U.S. Resided for years in the South, in the southern states of the United States of America. And that's where the slave trade resulted in millions of African people in the South. And even after the end of enslavement, that's where the majority, 90% of the African people lived in the United States of America. So that became sort of our national territory, if you will.
Yes, yeah. Tell us more about that, the African man and the African woman, their history, their past, and their current status today.
Mm-hmm. Well, we refer to ourselves as an African people, and the African man and woman in the United States of America has a particular kind of experience based on our presence in that country. And we ended up, after the period of enslavement in the South, most of our people, in a system that basically was an apartheid system. It was a system that was de facto segregationist or apartheid that was codified into official U.S. law in 1896. So the Civil War ended in 1865. There was a brief period referred to as Reconstruction from 1865 or so till 1877, where there was an attempt to try to incorporate the African into the larger settler colonial project. But of course, that effort was abandoned by 1877 in deference to a reconciliation between the Southern white ruling class and the Northern white ruling class. And the sacrifice was us, that is, handing back over control of the black population, the African population, back to the very same Southern whites that rebelled against the Union. So that is the reality that we had to operate from. And that was the reality up until we waged a struggle for human rights that intensified in the 1950s after the Second Imperialist War or the Second World War. But the apartheid system was in place, codified in 1896. It was the beginning of the process of reversing that was 1954 with the very famous so-called Brown decision that suggested that segregation in education was in fact unconstitutional, and that provided the impetus for the human rights struggle of African people in the United States of America. But that concept of human rights was quickly abandoned because human rights was associated with the Soviet Union and communism. And so the struggle was redefined in the U.S. as one for so-called civil rights or constitutional rights.
There have been several African resistance movements throughout the history. We have the Black Panther Party, and recently the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you compare these two parties together, and how much have they lived up to their promises?
Well, the Black Panther Party was in fact a party that emerged in the 1960s in this era of sort of general rebellion, if you will, on the part of African people in the United States. It was a formation that developed out of the consolidation of black radical forces, mainly being driven by another organization called the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM. And from these efforts to sort of internationalize the radical movement in the U.S., to begin to incorporate a colonial perspective, a position that suggested that not only were African people exploited by the system as workers, but they were oppressed as a national minority, as a people. And so there was the experience was national oppression and capitalist exploitation. So that kind of framing was the impetus for some of the young people that began to form what eventually became the Black Panther Party. Of course, before that, you had the activities of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a very, very important formation that was involved in breaking down the barriers of legal segregation in the South. The first Black Panther Party emerged in Lowndes County, Alabama, with the Panther symbol and all of it that became associated with the National Black Panther Party a few years later. So this was a formation that most people know about, but it wasn't the only one. Simultaneous to the Black Panther Party were other formations that had a radical take on politics in the U.S. That emergence, that development is very, very different than what is associated with the so-called Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement was a movement that was a bit more reformist in its orientation and perspective. The Black Panther Party was a party that, even though it was grounded in the black working class, It was a party that at the center of it was the traditional black radical concept of internationalism. It was a party that was committed to socialist transformation and anti-imperialism. And so even though black people were at the center, the perspective of the party was a general understanding that the system that oppressed black people in the U.S. was the same system oppressing black people in Africa, people in Asia, and people in Latin America. That it was the system of imperialism, the colonial capitalist system that had to be the target. And so that's a very different kind of perspective than with the Black Lives Matter movement that was primarily concerned with what they call racial justice and criminal justice reform, meaning reforming the colonial system, making it more fair, bringing about something called racial justice. Many people made the argument, how do you have racial justice in a system where there is a colonial relationship? What are you going to do, strengthen the colonial apparatus? So, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement was more sort of a smoke and mirrors than anything else. Not to disparage it completely, because there are a lot of people were able to sort of cut their teeth in terms of organizing and gaining some experience in that activity. But it's a very different kind of formation than, for example, the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace is explicitly anti-imperialist. It is clear on the absolute necessity for building structures and relationships between black people and other oppressed people. That even though black people are at the center of the organizing, we're not just concerned with black lives. We're concerned with oppression. That's why we're taking such a resolute position on the unfolding slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank. That's why we have stood in solidarity with oppressed people throughout the world. And so our movement, if you will, which is much larger than the Black Lives Matter movement ever was, is committed to a different kind of politics. And because of that, that's why people know about Black Lives Matter, but they don't know about the Black Alliance for Peace.
Why is that? Tell us more about it.
Because the Black Lives Matter movement was not, in essence, really oppositional. It was reformist. The Black Alliance for Peace is a formation that has revolutionary objectives. And so there's no benefit on the part of the state and powerful forces to promote the Black Alliance for Peace. You're never going to find our leadership on the cover of Time magazine or any of those kinds of publications. It's very easy for the system to incorporate and to champion a movement that, in essence, is a movement that wants to make the system better, wants to deal with its inequalities.
So, in a sense, one can conclude that the Black Lives Matter movement was somehow hijacked by the U.S. government?
And that's not what's even the government. It hijacked itself. Its objectives were never really that radical, if you will. And we say radical meaning going to the root of the problem facing black people and other oppressed people. So again, it wasn't really that oppositional, and it was dying out actually soon after it was launched. What then revived the so-called Black Lives Matter movement was the George Floyd protests that occurred. And at that point, that's when the real co-optation took place, because the government and other powerful forces placed the Black Lives Matter movement at the head of something they didn't even start. And then they pumped in millions of dollars into the Black Lives Matter network with the intent and the ultimate result that the movement fractured. And is really a shadow of its potential self. So yeah, it was incorporated, undermined, and really no longer needed.
You co-founded the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Gaza to support the South African case filed with the International Court of Justice. How parallel do you see the African struggle with that of the Palestinians?
It's fundamentally linked. Because again, it's an understanding of the structural reality that links those struggles. That the settler colonial project that continues in the U.S. Is mirrored by the settler colonial project in so-called Israel. And so the genocide that has been normalized in Gaza is a process that is threatening for all of us who are non-European and who are struggling for real change and who are attempting to defend human rights of the individual and of collectives. So we had no other choice but to find a way to try to support the case that was filed by the South Africans. So this coalition we helped to pull together was a coalition that in the initial phases of that filing by South Africa to try to pull together forces that would help to facilitate that case. We brought together a number of international lawyers that were in contact with various states to provide technical assistance for filing briefs, if you will, to support the South African case. But we understood that the legal aspect was important, but it wasn't sufficient. And so the coalition is attempting to help to coordinate the global work on the ground of supporting the resistance movement in Palestine and trying to galvanize opposition to the ongoing genocide. So that work was completely in alignment with the work and the concerns of the Black Alliance for Peace.
How soon do you think we'll see the downfall of Israel?
Well, it's...
And what does it require?
Well, that's an interesting question because some people have made the argument that the Zionist project is now finished, that as a consequence of the exposure of its essence, its true nature, that it would be very difficult for it to continue beyond this present phase. That the dependence that it has now on just raw force to continue has a shelf life that, like the South African situation, if the boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement takes off like we think it is going to take off, then it's going to help to facilitate the pressure that needs to be applied to Israel to design this project, to force political change. This notion of a two-state solution, there was always a phony prospect, now it's completely discredited. And discredited because you see the leadership of the Zionist project openly rejecting it. The Knesset just a few months ago passed a resolution that said basically we're not going to support the two-state. It's not on the table any longer. So who's pushing for a so-called two-state solution? Those forces who are still trying to mystify the reality on the ground in Israel, Palestine. That basically the possibility that there's going to be some type of landmass that can be called Palestine existing side by side with Israel. It's not going to happen. The only thing that can happen and will happen is a process of dismantling the Jewish supremacist state. That has to be a one state with people with equal rights. You can factor in certain kinds of protections, if you will, but that's the only route, a route similar in some ways to what happened in South Africa, but hopefully without the interest of the Palestinians being sold out the way the interests of Africans in South Africa were sold out in order for this elite to assume power.
And we're talking to Ajamu Baraka here on the show today. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
To have a chance, an opportunity to physically see this sacred ground. Now, I've been following this struggle here in Richmond for quite some time. Many people think that this is a local struggle, but in fact, it is a national struggle because of the importance of this spot in the slave trade that took place here in this country. So the fight to preserve the memory of what happened here so that we can not only memorialize this site, but to educate people on what happened here at this site and to talk about what the implications are for the slave trade and everything that developed from that point.
In 2016, you were a candidate for Vice President of the United States on the Green Party ticket. What does it take to be a candidate in this position?
Well, it really depends on the circumstances and the campaign. I had no intentions of ever participating in the electoral process. Not that I was opposed to it. I've always felt that there were real possibilities for radical politics in the electoral arena. But I didn't see myself playing that kind of role. But, you know, I think the real question is, what are the circumstances that can allow for a third party, if you will, in the U.S. to be able to compete? And the circumstances are very difficult because we have a two-party monopoly in the U.S. Those two parties are able to maintain that monopoly because they control the legal apparatus in the various states where you have to compete. And the way it's set up, it becomes very difficult for a third party to compete politically. They make the situation very almost impossible to run on the national level. You have to have an apparatus like the Green Party has right now that has the experience to be able to get itself on the ballots in order to compete on the national level. So in 2016, we were able to get on the ballot in 46 states, myself and Jill Stein. We had a significant ground apparatus. We were afforded some opportunities to be exposed to the American population. For example, CNN offered, and we took an opportunity to have a hour and a half, I think it was, town hall meeting. It was broadcast on CNN. But those kind of opportunities have not been extended because as the consequence of our campaign in 2016 and the election of Donald Trump, we bore a significant brunt of the criticism that it was our campaign to help usher in the Trump administration because in those key states that he lost, you know, they tried to connect up the votes that we received in those states and said it was our fault. Our position is that basically, you know, the people have a right to vote their preference. And no party should assume that certain votes belong to them. And that many of the people who voted for us, if we weren't on the ballot, they probably would not have voted at all. So this notion that they would automatically voted for the Democrats is nonsense. But as a consequence of that perception, and then the connection of our campaign to Russia, which resulted in the campaign being under a Senate investigation for 2.5 years after that, we see that in 2024, the kinds of small spaces offered to us in 2016, they no longer exist. They have not been offered. Even a so-called progressive outlet like Democracy Now! That gave us some degree of coverage, they have completely shut their door to the Jill Stein campaign. So it's very, very difficult. But these are the circumstances that one faces when you attempt to participate in an electoral process that basically is controlled by two parties representing two wings of capital.
How much do Americans want change? Thus, what are the chances of a third party winning?
Look, this year, more than 40% of the potential voters in the election and who participated in the electoral process said that they're open to a third party. There's significant dissatisfaction with both of the parties. And that's understood. And that's why the third parties are seen as such a threat to the party apparatuses of both the Republicans and the Democrats. And that's why they both conspire, well, more so the Democrats than the Republicans against the Green Party or any third party challenge. Within the context of the Democrat Party, you had the emergence of Robert F. Kennedy, his campaign, but because of the anti-democratic character of the Democratic Party, he was forced to try to run as an independent. It's a very difficult situation to try to exercise real democratic rights in an environment in which democracy is more used as a propaganda tool than a operational reality.
But is it feasible for a third party to win?
It's mathematically possible. I mean, for example, in 2016, we were on enough ballots, because you have the electoral college process, where theoretically we could have won. If we had won in certain states, all you need is 270 electoral votes. Because, of course, as your listeners probably know, there's no majoritarian process for the president in the United States of America. It's whoever wins the most electoral votes. So you have situations like Hillary Clinton actually winning more popular votes than Donald Trump, but she lost the election. So if you look at just the electoral college, then there's a possibility of a third party winning. In fact, that might be more possible in 2028 than even today. And once the American electoral system and society survives Donald Trump, and it will, then the factor of the fear and the argument for people voting a so-called lesser of two evils, that disappears. So theoretically, it can open up the process by 2028 if a Donald Trump was to win or whatever.
Non-white people say that white people are conducting a race war against them? This is absurd.
Say again.
The race war against black people has been going on ever since we've been in this country.
It's almost as if law enforcement officers killing black men, unarmed black men, non-aggressive black men who are not threats, is legal at this point.
My position is basically that there is already in place a white supremacist ruling class, that they want to have straight up and clear white supremacist domination.
You were among the cast of a documentary called Race War. And as its name is indicated,
Interesting. I forgot all about that one.
Yeah, it's focused on racial discrimination, as the name indicates. Tell us more about this movie and what it wants to portray.
The producers framed that movie as a movie that was supposed to expose the ongoing hegemony of white supremacy, to the extent that they were making an argument that very powerful forces were organized in such a way to not only deny the rights of black people and other non-European people, but they were prepared to go even further than that and actually pose a physical threat to the continued existence of the non-European populations, thus the concept of a race war. And so they raised up, they exposed some of the voices from the far right that articulate very openly the need for that kind of final solution to the race problem. And they then talked about the ongoing issues with police terror in black communities and in Latino communities, making the argument again that beneath the headlines, you have what they will argue is a continuation of a quote-unquote race war.
How well received was this documentary?
Well, again, it didn't get a lot of exposure, and of course, there's even some contradictory elements in the framing of the struggle in that way. There's no question that the reality of white supremacy is something that has to be confronted and dealt with. And when we say white supremacy, we're not just talking about the attitudes and the mentality of certain people, but the structural relationships, white power, if you will. That's a more accurate understanding of white supremacy than people's attitudes, people being white bigots or racist or whatever. But that wasn't the position of the producers of that particular documentary. So it got some degree of attention, but it wasn't something that we would necessarily embrace as a political project or representing the kind of political project that we've been talking about.
At one stage in your life, you became an Amnesty International volunteer and moved up the ranks in this organization. Give us an insider's perspective of what goes on in these kinds of organizations and what they do.
Well, interesting. I mean, when I began to embrace the human rights framework and saw its potential, I then began to work with the only formation in the world that had a worldwide membership base, and that's Amnesty International. People sometimes forget that. The AI is not like Human Rights Watch. That's mainly a staff-driven process. But Amnesty International, in fact, is a human rights movement, if you will. And so it being a membership-based movement, it has all of its contradictions with people and different perspectives, but it served, I think, a very useful role in helping to elevate an understanding of human rights and standing for certain human rights standards. And so while some people might argue that Amnesty has a tendency to be elevated, its reports when there is a crisis in the world that's receiving attention, a crisis usually driven by Western powers or the U.S., which is the same thing, and that Amnesty their reports will be used to provide support for the Western narrative. Well, that happens, but it also is another reality that Amnesty reports can also be used for the oppressed, because they do some pretty decent research.
Yeah, and that brings me to that next question, that, how effective, are such organizations like Amnesty International on, issuing such reports, on preventing genocide as we see today, on, promoting peace and justice? Does it really matter to those who commit, genocide as we see today, about Amnesty International's report or call?
Well, I think it does to a certain extent. Of course, when you have a situation like what we have today, where it is sort of general lawlessness, where you have certain states that are operating now as rogue states, then they would just ignore Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. But at the same time, they do recognize that there's a certain currency that these groups have, and because they are still involved in a propaganda war, a war of information. So it's not useful for them to be condemned by these organizations, because again, they will use it. They will use an Amnesty and Human Rights Watch for their own purposes when they need to. But when it's reversed, then they either ignore it or they try to also discredit it. So it has its role. I mean, look, there's a lot of issues. Amnesty has changed over the years. Its ability to provide worldwide coverage was undermined, in my opinion, when they started making certain kind of internal changes. And there's been a tendency over the last decade and a half, almost 2 decades, to become opportunistic in the sense of of trailing after some of the more sensational events in order to put his name out and to get into the media domain, which I think has hurt its credibility among many people.
During your lifetime, you've received many awards. In 2019, the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation awarded you with the U.S. Peace Prize. Tell us more about this prize and how did you achieve it?
Well, I couldn't tell you more about how I achieved it. I do the work, and the Peace Prize is an annual prize that they will identify someone who has a accumulated body of work promoting peace, and they have a process where they decide. And in 2019, they decided to provide me with that award. I appreciate it, but again, we are trying to do the work. If it's recognized in that way, we'll take it. But that's not, of course, the objective. The objective is to advance peace, to advance a different notion of peace, one that connects peace with the realization of social justice. And we will continue to do that as long as we are still walking on this side of the dirt.
Now I'm very pleased to announce that the U.S. Peace Prize this year is awarded to the Honorable Ajamu Baraka. So just read the awards from the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, honoring those who stand for peace. 2019 U.S. Peace Prize awarded to Ajamu Baraka, whose bold anti-war.
I accept this award this evening with great honor and humility. I accept not as an individual, but as a member of the Collective for Peace and Anti-War Activists, many of whom are in this room tonight, who paved the way with their great work. With their sacrifice, courage, and unwavering dedication to the ideal that we can live in a world without war.
At the end of every program, we request our guests to look into their camera and speak their mind about some issue that's most dear to them, that's most concerning to them.
That's a difficult question or a difficult comment, because there's so many things that are in fact dear to me. What's dear to me is the continued plight of oppressed people around the world. What's dear to me is the situation that haunts all of us with being exposed to the ongoing slaughter of Palestinian people. I literally wake up every morning thinking about Palestine. Now when I walk around, I go to the mall and I see families and I see the kids, I always think about these families that had to suffer watching their children being murdered, being crushed under cement, and seeing the absolute disregard for the value of these lives by the Western forces, in particular the U.S., that could end this slaughter with a phone call. So this situation with Palestine that's been live streamed to the world is indicative of the kind of absolute disregard for human life that we have seen that have emanated from the West. And it's something that has to be identified and confronted, because we have Palestine today, we had Libya a few years ago, we have the ongoing situation in the Congo, we have civil war in Sudan, we had a war in Ethiopia that should have been avoided. We have all of these situations where people are dying and suffering. And when you begin to look at the genesis of these issues, these crises that people are facing, you begin to narrow this down to one and a few particular sources. And we make the argument that if we are not able to shift power from the U.S. and from Europe, then all of us, I think, are facing a existential threat. We say very clearly that this U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination has to be seen as a threat to all of us. And if these forces are not prepared to live in peace with the rest of us, then we have no other choice but to try to move them away from their ability to impose their barbaric values on the rest of humanity. So these are the things that drive us. And we believe that if these things are embedded in the systems that govern this world, that more people around the world need to join us and join together in a resolute commitment to ensure that we can struggle together and that we can shift power, but more importantly, that we can build a new world. That's the intent, to build a new reality, to build new people. But it's going to take struggle, and it's going to take a faith in the ability of the people to, in fact, win that struggle. And that's what is dear to me, and that's what motivates my life.
Thank you, Ajamu.